Walls crack under the heat of 1,000 fires. Ash rains down like black snow. 40,000 riders surge forward in a wave of iron and leather. And inside the city, mothers hold their children knowing morning will never come for them. The ground shakes so hard that water trembles in every clay pot, and the screams blend together into a single sound that doesn't even seem human anymore. Gates splinter, towers collapse, and when the dust finally settles, the silence that follows is worse than the noise ever was. Because silence means it's over. Silence means there's no one left to scream. You've heard this version before. The savage nomad who galloped out of nowhere, leveled civilizations, and vanished back into the dust. Textbooks gave you a few paragraphs. Documentaries gave you the same recycled paintings of horses and arrows. And then the story moved on, like it was finished. But it wasn't finished, not even close, because the cities rose again. The gold changed hands a dozen times. What Genghis Khan actually left behind wasn't destruction. It was something far more unsettling. Something buried so deep inside the human species that we carried it for 800 years without knowing it was there. He didn't just conquer territories. He engineered the future of humanity itself. Genghis Khan weaponized bloodlines the way other rulers weaponized armies. After each conquest, he systematically eliminated entire male populations, not out of rage, but out of cold, patient calculation. Every man erased was a lineage canceled forever. Every son never born was a rival dynasty that would never rise. And into that biological vacuum, he planted his own seed, generation after generation, city after city, continent after continent. This wasn't war. This was selective breeding on a scale the world had never seen. And the terrifying part is that it worked. And here's the part that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Modern geneticists have identified a single Y-chromosome lineage so widespread, so dominant, that it defies everything we thought we knew about human reproduction. Roughly 1 out of every 200 men walking the earth right now carries DNA that traces back to one individual from the exact era of Genghis Khan. Let that satisfying number sit with you for a second. 16 million men alive today, connected by blood to one warlord who died almost 8 centuries ago. That's not ancient history. That's your neighbor, your co-worker, possibly your own reflection in the mirror. What you're about to hear will change how you see conquest, biology, and the invisible thread connecting millions of strangers across the planet. Before we go any further, drop your city and country in the comments, and if this channel isn't in your subscriptions yet, now's the time. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The real horror doesn't start with the siege. It starts after the gates fall silent. When the last defender drops his sword and the smoke begins to thin, that's when the machinery kicks in. Mongol officers move through the wreckage, not like looters, but like surgeons. They separate the living into groups with terrifying precision. Men to one side, women to another. Children pulled away from both. Elders, merchants, priests, noblewomen, servants, all dragged apart and forced into lines as if the entire city were being dismantled, not building by building, but person by person. There is no frenzy here, no blind rage, just cold, methodical sorting. And somewhere in the middle of it all, an officer gestures toward a wooden cart and gives a single command that will decide who survives the next hour. Later accounts describe the rule in almost absurdly simple terms. Some say it was the height of a cartwheel. Others say it was the axle pin. Any male who stood taller than that marker was pulled from the line and killed. Anyone shorter was kept alive, but not out of mercy. Think about what that means in a city of 100,000 people. No paperwork, no trial, no list of names, one object, one measurement, one verdict. Every grown man, every father, every son old enough to hold a blade or carry on a family name, gone before sunset. Boys small enough to pass under the line survived only to become slaves, soldiers, or tools of the empire that just swallowed their world. Women and girls lived in greater numbers, but freedom was not what waited for them. On the surface, it looks like raw, unthinking violence. A fast way to crush resistance and move on. But pull back far enough, and a pattern starts to emerge that changes everything. In that single act, Genghis Khan wasn't just killing fighters, he was amputating bloodlines. The city's oldest families, its proudest warriors, the men whose sons would have inherited their names and their power, all of them vanished in a single afternoon. Their bodies were dragged outside the walls and left in heaps, and buried with them were the Y-chromosomes they would have passed to the next generation, and the generation after that. Nobody standing in those blood-soaked streets had ever heard the word gene. DNA wouldn't be discovered for another 7 centuries, but the effect was identical to reaching forward through time and snapping entire branches off a family tree before they ever had a chance to grow. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't the random cruelty of a man drunk on power. It came from a world where bloodlines were the only currency that mattered. On the Mongol steppe, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, every man's worth was measured by the name of his father and the name of his father's father. Clans rose and collapsed based on ancestry alone. Genghis Khan himself, born around 1162 as Temujin, spent his childhood being kidnapped, betrayed, starved, and hunted precisely because his father's line had lost its grip on power. He learned the lesson early, and he learned it in his bones. A defeated enemy whose sons still breathe is an enemy who will come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, but eventually one of those sons will remember his father's name and pick up a weapon. So when Temujin finally united the warring tribes and turned his armies outward, he didn't just chase enemy soldiers across the plains. He chased lineages. After every major battle, his men hunted down nobles, princes, anyone whose name carried weight. Ruling families weren't just defeated, they were erased. Sometimes a handful of useful people were pulled from the killing. Craftsmen who could build siege engines, scribes who could translate documents, engineers who understood irrigation. But the men whose blood carried prestige, the ones whose very existence could inspire a future rebellion, those men were cut out of the living world like tumors. In an age centuries before anyone understood genetics, this was the most surgical way to control which bloodlines would continue and which would end forever. It was a weapon aimed not at the present, but at every generation yet to be born. Look at what happened when he turned his fury on the Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century. Genghis had sent traders and diplomats into that empire as a gesture of commerce. They were robbed. They were humiliated. Some were executed on the orders of the local governor. Genghis Khan's response wasn't a border skirmish or a punitive raid. It was annihilation on a scale the medieval world had never witnessed. Bukhara fell. Samarkand fell. Urgench fell. City after city crumbled under the weight of his armies. The accounts from those campaigns describe populations wiped out so thoroughly that fields went unplanted for a generation. Medieval chroniclers were notorious for inflating numbers, but even if you slash their estimates by half or by 3/4, what remains is still staggering. And in every account, the same detail resurfaces like a drumbeat. The men were killed. The women and children were taken. Adult male bodies choked the irrigation ditches. Women were divided among officers and soldiers. Children were sorted, some executed, some absorbed into the empire as servants or future warriors. That separation wasn't just about terrorizing survivors. It was about long-term architecture. The men who might carry forward the memory, the pride, the political claim of the old ruling class, they were eliminated. The women, who could bear children for the conquerors, were preserved. The empire Genghis was building wasn't just political, it was biological. Every conquered city became a laboratory for rewriting who would exist in the next century. The same blueprint repeated in China. Against the Western Xia and the Jin dynasty, Genghis and later his sons and generals unleashed campaigns of extraordinary brutality. Cities that surrendered quickly might be spared the worst. Cities that resisted paid with everything. Local rulers survived only if they dropped to their knees fast enough and completely enough. Many didn't. Entire royal houses disappeared from history as if they had never existed. The exact death toll is debated by historians to this day, but the direction of every estimate points the same way. Massive, systematic destruction of male lineages. The ancient elite families of northern China, Central Asia, and Persia were ground into dust, and their surviving daughters were folded into the households of the new Mongol ruling class. This is where Genghis Khan broke from the pattern of almost every conqueror who came before him. Most ancient emperors understood that you need local aristocrats. You need someone who speaks the language, knows the tax rolls, and can keep the countryside from starving. Genghis occasionally spared useful administrators, but again and again he tore out the top layer of male power and replaced it with his own relatives, his own generals, his own allies. Rulers who bent the knee early enough might keep their titles under suffocating Mongol oversight. Those who fought back were stripped down to nothing. Where a proud dynasty once stood, there would soon be a Mongol governor or a Mongol general whose authority flowed directly from Genghis himself, and whose bloodline was tied, directly or indirectly, to the same expanding clan. And this is the moment where brutality transforms into strategy. After destroying rival male lines across entire regions, Genghis didn't leave empty thrones and abandoned palaces. He filled the vacuum with himself and his chosen circle. When a conquered prince's widow was brought into the Mongol camp, she often became a wife or concubine to Genghis or one of his sons. In some documented cases, the widows of defeated kings bore children to their new Mongol overlords within a year of their husband's execution. Those children carried the status of their Mongol father and the cultural knowledge of their local mother. To the outside world, it looked like a new ruling family with deep roots in the region. Beneath the surface, it meant the Y-chromosome passing through that new elite was part of a single, ever-expanding genetic cluster. Genghis Khan is said to have taken wives and concubines numbering in the hundreds, possibly more. Chroniclers disagree on the precise count, but never on the scale. His first and primary wife, Berta, gave him the sons recognized as his legitimate heirs. Beyond her, there were princesses seized from conquered courts, noble women offered as tributes, daughters of defeated kings handed over as terms of surrender. Every one of these unions produced children who were born into privilege that ordinary people could never dream of. Better food, better protection, better access to power and resources. Those children grew up more likely to survive childhood, more likely to marry well, more likely to have large families of their own. In the language of modern biology, they had a massive built-in advantage in the genetic lottery before they ever took their first breath. And he didn't keep this advantage to himself. His sons and grandsons were handed entire civilizations to rule. The territories that would become the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the empire in China later governed by Kublai Khan. All of them were entrusted to direct descendants of Genghis, and every single one of those descendants followed the same playbook. They married the daughters of local elites. They accepted noble women as part of peace negotiations. They installed their relatives in cities that had been stripped of their old male leadership. Each of these moves blended the prestige of ancient local dynasties with the blood of the Mongol imperial family. On the surface, it looked like political compromise. Underneath, it was the quiet, systematic replacement of one set of male chromosomes with another. And here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Nobody in the 13th century had the faintest idea what a Y-chromosome was. They spoke of seed, of blood, of bone. Not alleles, not genetic markers, but they understood the core principle with absolute clarity. Sons carry the father's line. Kill a man and all his sons, and that line is finished forever. Place your own sons on his throne and give them his surviving daughters as wives, and the future belongs to you. Without a single piece of scientific equipment, without a single diagram of human DNA, they were running a brutal, instinctive version of population engineering on a continental scale. Centuries later, when modern geneticists began mapping male lineages across Central Asia, they stumbled onto something that stopped them cold: an enormous cluster of men carrying nearly identical Y-chromosome markers, all tracing back to a single common ancestor who lived in the exact era of Genghis Khan. The study was published long after his empire had crumbled to dust, but the genetic blueprint it revealed fits the historical record like a key sliding into a lock. Mass killings of local men, survival of women. A new ruling class built entirely around one clan. Whether every detail was consciously planned from the beginning or evolved through habit and brutal repetition, the outcome is identical. Old male bloodlines were ripped out by the root. A new one spread into the empty ground like a vine with no competition. Now picture the demographic shockwave rolling through a single conquered city over just 1 or 2 generations. Most of the adult men are dead. In the decade that follows, there are far fewer local fathers available. The surviving women bear children, but many of those children are fathered by occupying Mongol soldiers, officers, and nobles. If the conquerors hold power long enough, and they almost always did, those mixed children grow up with advantages their purely local peers can never match. They inherit the protection and status that comes with belonging to the new order. Now multiply that effect across dozens of cities, across multiple fallen empires, across several generations running in parallel, and what you get is a slow, grinding, unstoppable shift in whose DNA dominates an entire continent. This is what separates Genghis Khan's violence from the random massacres that litter every century of human history. Not every killing was part of some meticulously written genetic master plan. Armies in every era have slaughtered out of rage, out of fear, out of petty revenge. But in the repeating pattern of his conquests, something far more structured emerges. Systematic removal of rival male elites, systematic capture and redistribution of women, systematic promotion of his sons and grandsons into positions where they had privileged access to wives and concubines on a scale no other family on earth could match. Over decades, this becomes something that looks less like war and more like policy. A genetic reset executed through swords, decrees, and marriage beds. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, this blueprint was already operating across a landmass stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Millions of people were dead. Entire dynasties had been scrubbed from existence. Yet inside the camps and palaces of the new Mongol aristocracy, his descendants were multiplying at a rate that would have stunned him if he could have seen the numbers. They weren't just inheriting territory. They were inheriting reproductive dominance over entire conquered populations. Viewed through the cold lens of biology, the first phase of his empire wasn't about conquest at all. It was about clearing the ground, burning away every competing bloodline, and preparing the soil for something far more enduring. A massive, controlled, relentless expansion of his own genetic signature into the bodies of millions who hadn't even been born yet. And that raises a question that won't let you go once you've heard it. Wiping out rival bloodlines on this scale creates space, yes, but empty space alone doesn't explain how one man ends up with millions of genetic descendants 8 centuries later. Thrones can be seized, land can be occupied, but for a single Y-chromosome to push its way into such a staggering percentage of the global population, there has to be something more than massacres. There has to be a system, a machine that keeps feeding that bloodline forward, year after year, generation after generation, long after the original conqueror is dust in an unmarked grave. The killing cleared the field. Something else had to plant, cultivate, and expand the new growth until it became unstoppable. Before we step into that second phase, a quick pause. If you're still here, if this kind of deep, uncomfortable history is what keeps you watching, then you are exactly who we built this channel for. We've created an inner circle called The Lineage. It's our membership community, the people who go beyond just watching and actually keep these investigations alive. When you join, you're not just another subscriber. You become part of the small group that makes it possible for us to spend weeks buried in academic papers, primary sources, and genetic studies, turning them into the kind of content you won't find anywhere else. Members get early access to new episodes and behind-the-scenes updates on what's coming next. If that sounds like where you belong, hit the join button and step inside the lineage. Stand with us, because what comes next is where the story shifts from open slaughter to something quieter and far more disturbing. The burning cities and the mountains of corpses were only the beginning. What followed was a vast, silent network of guarded roads, controlled households, and carefully managed harems, all built around a single objective: maximizing the reproductive output of one clan sitting at the top of the world. Genghis Khan had cleared away rival male bloodlines on a scale no human being had ever attempted. The question now is how he and his descendants turned that emptiness into a living empire of flesh and blood, whose echo still pulses inside modern DNA tests 800 years later. And that is exactly where we're going next. There's a number at the center of this story that refuses to let you look away. If roughly 1 out of every 200 men alive today carries a Y-chromosome traceable to the line of Genghis Khan, that's not thousands. That's tens of millions of living human beings. And a number like that doesn't just appear. It has to be constructed. Birth by birth, generation by generation. Over the course of 800 years, one man, no matter how powerful, no matter how many wives he takes, can only father so many children in a single lifetime. So if his genetic fingerprint is that widespread today, violence alone doesn't explain it. There had to be infrastructure. There had to be a machine, a system designed to keep pushing his bloodline forward while systematically cutting every competing line down. Start with the most basic constraint of all: time. A man only has so many years of fertility. Even if Genghis Khan began fathering children as a teenager and lived into his mid-60s, there's a hard biological ceiling on how many women he could be with in any given year. Now, layer on top of that the demands of running the largest land empire in human history. Endless war councils, campaigns that lasted months, thousands of kilometers of travel on horseback, illness, injury, exhaustion. For him to produce a massive number of surviving sons, he needed two things working simultaneously. First, constant, uninterrupted access to women on a scale that would stagger the imagination. Second, a support apparatus that housed those women, fed them, protected them, moved them when the empire shifted, and kept every rival male far away from them. That is the difference between ordinary reproduction and something that functions like an industrial operation. The Mongols didn't leave behind a tidy registry of every wife and concubine, but every major source agrees on the broad shape. Genghis maintained a small inner circle of primary wives, beginning with Berta, who held the highest status and bore the sons recognized as his legitimate heirs. Surrounding that core was a vastly larger ring of secondary wives, consorts, and concubines, many of them drawn directly from the families of conquered peoples. Some were daughters of allied tribal chiefs, offered as part of political marriages. Others were noble women seized after sieges. Some were chosen for their family connections, others for youth, beauty, or the symbolic weight their capture carried. By the time his empire stretched from the forests of northern China to the edges of Persia, he likely had hundreds of women living under his authority within this system. And these women were not kept in a single location. Genghis Khan didn't rule from a throne room. He ruled from the saddle. He had no fixed capital in the traditional sense. Instead, he maintained several royal encampments, each one called an ordo, scattered across the steppe at strategic distances. Each ordo was a self-contained mobile court with its own tents, livestock, servants, guards, and hierarchy. Different primary wives managed different camps. As Genghis moved across his territories, he could rotate through these camps in sequence, spending enough time at each to manage political affairs, issue military orders, and maintain his sprawling family. This rotating system meant that at virtually any point in any season, he had access to multiple households, each one filled with women whose primary function within the empire was to bear and raise his children. Sustaining a system like this required a constant pipeline of new women flowing into the machine. And that's where his elite guard corps, the Keshig, enters the picture. On the surface, the Keshig were personal bodyguards and close attendants. They watched his tent through the night. They flanked him in battle. They controlled access to his camps. But they were also his most trusted operatives, the men he sent to handle tasks that required absolute loyalty and discretion, collecting tribute, escorting foreign envoys, and managing the most sensitive business inside freshly conquered cities. When a city fell, ordinary soldiers might loot and seize captives in the chaos. But the most valuable captives didn't stay in that chaos for long. Officers and Keshig members moved in quickly to impose order on the selection process. Accounts from across the Mongol conquests describe something that resembles a grading system applied to human beings. Women were separated according to age, physical appearance, and social rank. Daughters and widows of rulers were identified and pulled aside. Noble families were singled out from the general population. Young women judged to be exceptionally attractive were reserved and set apart. These selected women were then assigned to different destinations based on their perceived value. Some were distributed as rewards to generals and senior commanders. Some were absorbed into the households of Mongol princes, and a smaller, more carefully chosen group was sent directly toward the Khan himself. Transporting these women across distances that could span thousands of kilometers required far more than a few horses and a guard detail. The Mongol Empire had built a relay network called the Yam, a chain of way stations positioned every few dozen kilometers across the empire, each one stocked with fresh horses, food, and supplies. Riders carrying imperial messages could cross the entire empire at astonishing speed by swapping mounts at every station. That same infrastructure could move other cargo as well, including human cargo. When the Keshig or senior officers selected women destined for the Great Khan, those women could be sent along the Yam routes under armed escort, delivered to whichever ordo Genghis was occupying at that moment. His personal harem wasn't a static collection confined to one camp. It was a continental intake system, drawing women from every corner of the empire and funneling them toward a single man. Inside those camps, life operated under rigid hierarchies. Primary wives occupied their own large tents with personal attendants and genuine authority over household affairs. Secondary wives and concubines were arranged in descending tiers beneath them. Even among the captives, informal rankings formed over time. Some rose to become trusted household managers. Others remained in roles closer to servitude. But every woman, regardless of rank, lived under close supervision. And the children born within these camps were tracked with particular attention, especially the boys. Their nutrition, their education, their military training were all monitored, because every surviving son represented a potential future governor, military commander, or political asset. This level of organized care kept childhood mortality significantly lower than what ordinary herding families experienced outside the royal circle. Better food, better shelter, better medical attention. More children surviving long enough to grow up and have children of their own. Genghis didn't hoard this reproductive advantage for himself alone. His sons and grandsons were each given enormous territories to govern, and each one built a court that mirrored the father's system almost exactly. Yochi in the Western Territories, Chagatai across Central Asia, Ogadai on the Central Steppe, Tolui controlling the Mongol heartlands. Every one of them maintained multiple wives and their own expanding circles of concubines. Every one of them received noble women from conquered peoples as primary wives. Every one of them absorbed captives after sieges. Every one of them used the same relay network, the same guarding structures, the same distribution patterns. The result wasn't a single powerful man with many children. It was an entire constellation of genetically related men, each one producing large numbers of offspring spread across a landmass that covered most of the known world. Now, consider what status meant in this equation. In virtually every civilization of that era, high-ranking men enjoyed special access to women of their own class, plus the power to acquire additional wives and concubines that ordinary men could never dream of. A common herder might struggle to marry even once. A powerful Khan or prince could accumulate dozens of partners. The Mongol system took this universal imbalance and amplified it beyond anything the world had seen. Because they had destroyed so many local male elites, there were dramatically fewer high-status local men left to compete for noble women. When a Mongol prince married the princess of a shattered dynasty, the old royal bloodline didn't completely vanish, but its future now flowed through his Y-chromosome. Their sons would carry his paternal line forward, not the defeated kings. Compound this over time, and the imbalance becomes staggering. The male descendants of Genghis Khan and his inner circle produced large families with high survival rates. They married into the remnants of old noble houses again and again. Meanwhile, the male lines of those older dynasties were either gone entirely or reduced to a shadow of their former numbers. War, disease, and political purges continued to batter the general population, but the protected bloodline at the top kept reproducing behind a wall of wealth, power, and imperial privilege. In modern terms, their genes traveled on a safer track. The empire around them might convulse with violence and instability, but at the center, the blood of one clan was shielded from the worst of it. The Mongols also made a deliberate practice of planting trusted family members in charge of key cities and strategic regions. Rather than relying on local administrators whose loyalty might waver, they installed sons, brothers, nephews, favored grandsons. Each of these appointees gained access to local women in exactly the same way their patriarch had. They married daughters of surviving elites to cement alliances. They received women as tribute. They took captives. Every appointment created a new insertion point, where the same Y-chromosome lineage could enter a fresh population and begin spreading. By the era of Kublai Khan in China or Batu Khan in the territories of the Golden Horde, you're looking at a web of ruling houses spread across half the world, every one of them sharing a common male ancestor in Genghis. This is where the mathematics of compound growth become terrifyingly real. Run a rough scenario. Suppose Genghis Khan himself fathered dozens of sons who survived to adulthood. Each of those sons, installed in positions of enormous power, could in turn father dozens more. If every generation of elite males in this clan left 10, 20, or more surviving sons, then the number of male descendants doesn't grow. It detonates, and because so many of them held rank, wealth, and military protection, their family lines were dramatically more stable than those of ordinary men. Not every branch would flourish. Some would be killed in wars, wiped out by plague, or eliminated in palace coups. But enough survived, insulated by privilege, to keep the total count climbing faster than the surrounding population could ever match. Plenty of rulers throughout history tried to build sprawling dynasties. Pharaohs married within their own families to concentrate power. Roman emperors adopted promising generals to continue their names. Medieval kings across Europe and the Islamic world took multiple wives and maintained mistresses. Yet most of those bloodlines eventually died out. Civil wars consumed them. Plagues erased them. Invasions and religious upheavals scattered them to nothing. The clan of Genghis Khan was different. It spread across such a vast geographic area that no single disaster could destroy it all at once. When one branch collapsed in Persia, others thrived in the Russian steppe. When the Yuan dynasty fell in China, cousins still held power 1,000 miles to the west. The Mongol Empire as a political entity eventually shattered into pieces, but the bloodlines running through its core were already embedded too deeply and too widely to be uprooted. And there's another factor that can't be ignored: the cultural weight of the name itself. In many regions across Central Asia and beyond, claiming descent from Genghis Khan or from one of his recognized sons became one of the most powerful status markers a family could possess. Families guarded that claim fiercely. They kept genealogical records. They arranged marriages specifically to maintain and extend the connection. In some cases, they had every incentive to spread that bloodline even further, marrying their sons into as many local families as possible to build networks of loyalty, alliance, and prestige. Nobody at the time used the language of genetics, but they were thinking in terms of lineage, honor, and the inherited right to rule. And those values act as a preservation engine for a male bloodline, carrying it forward far beyond what random chance alone would ever allow. All of this taken together: the mass extermination of rival males, the systematic gathering of women, the guarded harems operating like biological factories, the relay roads built to move human cargo across continents, the strategic placement of sons as regional rulers, the calculated marriages into surviving local elites, it adds up to something far larger than any single policy or any single decision. It becomes a self-perpetuating system. Generation after generation, it performs the same function, reducing the number of competing male bloodlines at the top and expanding the reach of one specific cluster of Y chromosomes into every population it touches. For the millions of people living under Mongol rule, this was simply the shape of their world. For us, looking backward with the tools of modern genetics, it looks like a biological engine that never stopped running, as long as the houses of Genghis Khan held power. Centuries ground past. The Mongol Empire fractured into rival states. New powers rose on its bones. Some branches of the imperial family lost their thrones. Others dissolved into local cultures until their Mongol origins were barely remembered. In China, the Yuan dynasty collapsed. In Persia, the Ilkhanate disintegrated. The Golden Horde in the West splintered into warring fragments. But the descendants themselves didn't vanish. They blended into the aristocracies, the warrior classes, the merchant families of Central Asia, Persia, Russia, India, and beyond. Many of them lost the title of Khan generations ago, but kept the blood. Ordinary people, descended from populations conquered centuries earlier, often had no idea which long-dead noblemen in their family tree had once belonged to the house of Genghis. But the line kept moving quietly through marriages, births, and migrations, invisible and unstoppable. By the 20th century, the political empire of Genghis Khan was ancient history. Borders had been redrawn dozens of times. New religions, new ideologies, new nation-states had swept through his former territories. But his possible genetic footprint, if the emerging theory held true, was at its absolute widest. Every time a male descendant fathered a son, that same Y-chromosome moved one step further into the future. Every time a war or a famine or an epidemic killed off competing male lines, the proportional share belonging to his lineage ticked upward. Over 800 years, with no one on Earth aware of the molecular mechanics driving it, his bloodline had accomplished exactly what his armies once did. It expanded into every space that opened up. It took modern science to finally see it. In the closing decades of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st, geneticists began conducting large-scale population studies using tools that hadn't existed a generation earlier. One of their most powerful instruments was the Y-chromosome itself. Because it passes from father to son with remarkably little alteration, it serves as an almost perfect tracer for male lineage across deep stretches of time. By collecting DNA samples from men across dozens of different ethnic groups and geographic regions and comparing their Y-chromosome markers side by side, scientists could construct detailed maps showing how male bloodlines had spread, merged, and diverged over centuries and millennia. When they focused their analysis on Central Asia, they expected to find a richly diverse mosaic of lineages reflecting the region's extraordinarily complex history of migration, conquest, trade, and intermarriage. And they did find diversity. But buried inside that diversity was something that made them stop and look again. A massive cluster of men, scattered across many different populations and ethnic groups, who all carried an almost identical pattern on their Y-chromosomes. The similarities were so tight that these men had to share a common ancestor who lived in the relatively recent past. Not some shadowy figure from the Stone Age. Someone much closer. When the researchers applied mutation rate calculations to estimate when that common ancestor lived, the genetic clock pointed directly at the 13th century. Before I tell you what they concluded, let me pull you out of the laboratory and back into this moment for a second. Everything you're hearing in this episode is built on the work of historians and geneticists who spent years, sometimes decades, digging through primary sources, archaeological evidence, and molecular data. We've shaped it into a narrative, but the spine of this story is a serious, peer-reviewed body of research. The central book we used as the foundation for this investigation is available to you right now through the View Products button on your screen. It is not a casual read. It's a dense, unflinching, and at times genuinely disturbing examination of Genghis Khan, his empire, and the shadow it cast over human biology for 8 centuries. If you want to go beyond this video and examine the evidence for yourself, that book belongs on your shelf. And that's not all you'll find there. When you open that same product shelf, you'll discover a curated lineup of themed artifacts connected to this story. I won't spoil exactly what they are, because the inventory rotates, but they're designed to pull you deeper into this world, immersive pieces and dark memorabilia that transform what you're watching into something you can physically hold. Alongside those, you'll see our ongoing project, the official Ancestral collection, essential dark history books you should own. It's a hand-selected library of works that we believe every serious viewer of this channel should read in their lifetime. Open the shelf. Explore while you listen. Start building your own archive as we press forward. Back in the laboratory, the data staring up from those Central Asian samples forced a question that nobody could avoid. Who was this shared ancestor? The timeline aligned precisely with the rise of the Mongol Empire. The geographic distribution of the cluster matched the heartlands of Genghis Khan's conquests and the territories governed by his sons and grandsons. The sheer scale of the cluster demanded an ancestor with extraordinary reproductive success and sustained multi-generational protection for his male descendants. There were other powerful men in that era, but only one whose geographic reach, political dominance, and documented biological strategy fit the genetic pattern with this degree of precision. By the time the landmark study was published in the early 2000s, the researchers were prepared to make an extraordinary claim that this vast Y-chromosome cluster most likely originated from Genghis Khan himself, or from a very close male relative in his direct patrilineal line. The conclusion wasn't universally accepted. Debates erupted over interpretation, sample sizes, statistical methodology, and the inherent limitations of genetic inference at this scale. But the fundamental architecture of the finding held. Somewhere in Central Asia, around the time of Genghis Khan, one man's Y-chromosome embarked on a journey that would end up replicated inside the cells of millions of people living 8 centuries later. What those scientists uncovered, and the method by which they uncovered it, permanently altered how we understand the past. History was no longer confined to what was written in chronicles or carved into stone. It was written inside human cells. With every saliva sample dropped into a plastic collection tube, invisible stories began surfacing from the deep code of the human body. And among all those stories, one lineage stood out like a scar cut across the genetic landscape of an entire continent. In the next section, we're going to step fully inside that modern investigation. We'll break down exactly what the geneticists saw in their data, how they built the link to the Mongol era, and what it truly means when we say that one man's DNA may be present inside one out of every 200 men breathing on this planet right now. Because here's the part that should unsettle you most. This isn't just about Genghis Khan. Once you accept that one warlord's reproductive strategy left a mark this deep in the human species, you have to confront a much larger question. What other invisible empires are still living inside us? What other forgotten conquerors, slave traders, or warlords quietly shape the genetic architecture of people walking the earth today without anyone ever knowing? To begin answering that, we have to start with the cold, hard data from 2003, the moment when the ghost of a man dead for nearly 8 centuries appeared not in a legend, not in a poem, but in a printout from a DNA sequencing machine. And that is exactly where we're heading next. The room has no windows that matter, no dust, no hoofbeats, just the sterile hum of processors and the glow of a monitor filling with data. It's the early 2000s. An international team of geneticists is feeding thousands of DNA samples from men across Central Asia into their analysis software. They aren't searching for Genghis Khan. They aren't searching for anyone in particular. They're mapping patterns, tracing how male lineages migrated and mixed over centuries. One researcher runs a clustering algorithm that groups similar Y chromosomes together. The screen populates with colored nodes. Most clusters are modest, expected, unremarkable. But one cluster isn't modest. One cluster is enormous. They run it again, same result. This isn't what a normal genetic landscape looks like. In a typical population across a typical region, you'd expect to see many different Y chromosome lineages, each carried by a moderate number of men, creating a relatively even distribution. You might see a few lineages slightly more common than others, but here, across a geographic belt stretching from Mongolia through its neighboring territories, a single lineage towers above everything else. In some populations sampled, a startling fraction of men carry it, and the Y chromosome patterns from man to man are nearly identical, separated only by the tiniest mutations, the kind that accumulate slowly over many generations of father-to-son transmission. The team runs the math. They know the approximate rate at which mutations appear on the Y chromosome. That rate functions as a molecular clock. If all these men share a pattern this similar, their most recent common ancestor can't be ancient. Not tens of thousands of years back. Not even a few thousand, just a handful of centuries. When they plug their data into the calculation, the answer lands between 800 and 1,000 years in the past, the 13th century. Now they overlay the data onto a map. Where does this Y chromosome cluster appear? It's densest in Mongolia and the surrounding regions. It surfaces again and again along the exact corridors where the Mongol Empire expanded. Northern China, broad swaths of Central Asia, territories once governed by the Golden Horde, lands scarred by the campaigns of Genghis Khan and his successors. The distribution isn't random. It isn't uniform. It follows, with unsettling precision, the geographic footprint of a single historical eruption. The rise, expansion, and fragmentation of the Mongol world. At this stage, nobody on the team has written the name Genghis Khan in their research notes. Millions of men lived in the 13th century. Millions had sons. But as the analysis deepens, the question becomes impossible to sidestep. Who, living in that exact region at that exact time, could have stamped a mark this massive onto the male population of an entire continent? Who possessed the political dominance, the military reach, and the reproductive infrastructure to spread a single Y chromosome across so many different ethnic groups and geographic boundaries? The list of plausible candidates is vanishingly short, and at the very top of that list stands the founder of the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. When the study is published in 2003, the researchers describe what they've found as a star cluster. At the center sits a single male ancestor. Radiating outward from that center point are branches shooting in every direction, each one representing a line of sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons who spread geographically over generations, each line slowly accumulating its own small, unique mutations along the way. The resulting shape in the data looks exactly like a dense core, with beams extending outward. A star with rays of light. The team estimates that this cluster is carried by approximately 8% of the male population across a vast region of Asia, and roughly 0.5% of all men on the planet. That translates to about 1 in every 200 men alive at the time the study was conducted. They stop just short of declaring it the DNA of Genghis Khan. Science demands caution. They refer instead to a common ancestor who most likely lived in Mongolia during the era of the Mongol Empire and who must have experienced what they carefully term extreme reproductive success. But they also lay the historical evidence alongside the genetic evidence and let the parallels speak for themselves. We know Genghis Khan and his direct male descendants governed an empire spanning most of Asia. We know they maintained privileged, virtually unlimited access to wives and concubines. We know they systematically eliminated rival male lineages and replaced them with their own. We know that even after the empire fractured into successor states, families claiming patrilineal descent from Genghis held power in multiple regions for centuries afterward. When you align those historical realities with the star cluster data, the conclusion becomes almost impossible to resist. If the ancestor at the center of that cluster is not Genghis Khan himself, he is almost certainly a very close male relative, perhaps his father or his grandfather. Either way, the underlying story remains the same. The rise of the Mongol imperial family triggered a sustained continent-wide surge of a single Y-chromosome lineage that has no parallel in recorded human genetics. Not every scientist agrees with every element of the interpretation. Other researchers have questioned whether the sample sizes are large enough to support such sweeping conclusions, whether the assumed mutation rate is calibrated correctly, whether some other powerful but historically obscure warlord might account for the data. That's the nature of science. Results are tested, challenged, refined, sometimes overturned. But over the 2 decades since the initial publication, the fundamental picture has proven remarkably durable. There is a male lineage that detonated in the 13th century, in precisely the region and historical context where Genghis Khan built his empire. Its geographic spread mirrors the documented behavior and territorial reach of his descendants. And it persists today in the cells of tens of millions of living men. Let those numbers become something concrete for a moment. Picture a country with 10 million men. If the 1 in 200 estimate holds across that population, roughly 50,000 of those men carry this specific Y-chromosome lineage. Now scale that globally. When the original study was published, the researchers estimated approximately 16 million men worldwide carried this marker. Given population growth in the years since, the actual number today is almost certainly higher. Every single one of those men represents the endpoint of an unbroken chain of fathers and sons, stretching backward through border fortresses and tribal councils, through palace bedrooms and military encampments, through royal tents and relay stations, all the way back to one man standing in the 13th century. And that's only the male line. Y-chromosomes tell one narrow thread of the story. They trace only the father-to-son pathway. But Genghis Khan and his clan also had daughters. Those daughters married into other families. Their children inherited half their DNA from the Mongol side and half from their local father. Over centuries, that blended ancestry dispersed into the wider population through pathways far more complex and far harder to trace. Genealogists often point out that after enough generations, a historically prominent figure can appear somewhere in the family tree of an extraordinarily large number of living people, even if only a tiny fraction carry his Y chromosome. In practical terms, if your ancestry traces back anywhere near the old Mongol sphere of influence, there is a chance, not a certainty, but not a trivial probability either, that you are a distant descendant of Genghis Khan through some winding branch of your family tree. This is the moment where ancient history stops being abstract and becomes personal. For most people, Genghis Khan is a name on a textbook page or a thumbnail on a documentary they never clicked. He's the Mongol conqueror from the early 1200s. The violence he unleashed exists as numbers and dates that feel safely remote. But when you learn that his lineage may live inside 1 out of every 200 men on Earth right now, that distance collapses. The past isn't just behind us. Part of it is physically inside us. The decisions he made about who lived and who was executed, who bore children and who was denied the chance, those decisions didn't stay locked inside walled cities and scorched battlefields. They traveled silently through time, carried inside human bodies, generation after generation, until they reached the present moment. We need to be careful about how we frame this. Some people hear that they might descend from Genghis Khan and treat it as a badge of honor, a mark of power and resilience. That reaction is human and understandable. But it erases what this so-called success actually cost everyone else. His genetic victory is inseparable from the annihilation of countless other lineages. For his Y-chromosome to achieve this level of prevalence, millions of rival men had to die without producing male heirs. Entire cities had to be burned to the ground. Women had to be torn from their families and forced into unions they never chose. Children had to be born into systems that treated them as instruments of imperial expansion, not as human beings. Modern genetics can identify winners in the purely biological sense. It cannot and does not confer moral approval. A Y chromosome that appears frequently in today's population isn't superior to any other Y chromosome. It's simply a record of how power, violence, and social architecture gave certain men vastly more opportunities to reproduce than others. In the case of Genghis Khan, his apparent genetic triumph functions like a shadow cast across centuries, revealing the outline of a crime so large it defies easy comprehension. Generations of coordinated killing and coerced reproduction that erased entire alternative futures so that his bloodline could fill the vacuum. Think back to that cartwheel in the conquered city. The men forced into a line, measured against a wooden spoke, and killed if they stood too tall. Think about the noble families of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Western Shia, and the Jin dynasty. Their male members hunted down and executed until the name itself was meaningless. Think about the Keshig officers moving through the wreckage of a siege, pulling the daughters of princes from the crowd and dispatching them under armed guard across thousands of kilometers to the Khan's encampments. Think about the yam relay stations passing human cargo from post to post, like packages. Think about the royal tents where primary wives and concubines lived under strict routines designed to protect and maximize the children of the ruling bloodline. None of these are separate stories. Together, they form a single unbroken path that leads directly from the 13th century to that star cluster glowing on a geneticist's screen. The scientists who discovered this pattern didn't set out to render a moral verdict. They followed data. They collected saliva samples from volunteers. They examined Y chromosomes under the most rigorous analytical methods available. They applied mutation rates and population models. But when their results were placed alongside the historical record, they exposed something that no chronicle, no manuscript, no carved inscription could ever have shown on its own. The true scale of one man's reach into the bodies of people who would be born centuries after his death. And here's another truth that makes the picture even more unsettling. Genghis Khan is not alone. Other genetic studies have identified similar patterns, smaller in scale but structurally identical, tied to powerful lineages in different parts of the world. Ruling families who maintained large harems, fathered many children, and held political dominance for generations. In some cases, these genetic signatures can be tentatively linked to known historical dynasties. In others, the names have been lost entirely. But the biological imprint remains like a fingerprint left at a scene where no one remembers the crime. Every time a society concentrates reproductive control in the hands of a small group of elite men, the gene pool warps around them. Genghis Khan is simply the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeats throughout human history. So what do we do with this knowledge? We can't change what happened. The millions who died under Mongol conquest are beyond anyone's reach. The women forced into imperial households can't be rescued across 8 centuries. The children born into those systems lived and died in a world they never chose. What we can do is refuse to flatten this story into a simple adventure about great conquerors and their glorious empires. We can look at the numbers without flinching. Genghis Khan's apparent success as a genetic ancestor is built on a foundation of deliberate, systematic destruction. His empire of DNA rests on the erased names, erased families, and erased futures of millions of people whose bloodlines were terminated so that his could expand. For you watching this right now, there's one more implication worth sitting with. Every time someone spits into a plastic tube for a consumer ancestry test, they're adding another data point to the map of human history. Most testing companies don't report Genghis Khan as a result, and they shouldn't. The star cluster is a scientific construct, not a tidy family label you can print on a certificate. But the more we learn about how power deforms genetics over centuries, the more carefully we need to think about what it means to be related to famous historical figures. Maybe you're one of the millions of men carrying that Y-chromosome signature right now. Maybe you're not. Either way, you live in a world whose genetic architecture was partly shaped by the fact that one 13th century warlord decided that only his bloodline and the bloodlines of his closest allies deserved to continue in full. The story of Genghis Khan is almost always told as a military epic. Cavalry charges sweeping across open plains, siege engines cracking city walls, diplomatic maneuvers, and lightning-fast communication networks. All of that is real, and all of it matters. But if you stop there, you miss the deepest and most disturbing layer of the story. His most lasting conquest didn't end when his armies rode over the horizon or when his empire fractured into warring successor states. It continued silently through the lives of his descendants, through the choices of rulers who traded on his prestige, through marriages arranged centuries after his bones were hidden in an unmarked grave. And it continues right now, in this moment. Every time one of those men carrying the star cluster Y-chromosome fathers a son. The empire he drew on maps vanished. The empire he built inside human bodies never did. And this is why this story matters beyond the history books. It's not just about one warlord or one region or one century. It's about how violence, hierarchy, and the concentration of reproductive control can leave marks in the human species that outlast every fortress, every law, every empire, every religion. It's about how the decisions of a small group of men in one century can reshape the biological future of millions of people who will never know their names. When we say the ghost of Genghis Khan is still with us, we're not using a metaphor. We're describing strands of DNA that originated in his era and still replicate inside living cells today. If you've stayed with me all the way through the fires, the sorting lines, the relay stations, the guarded tents, and the glow of a laboratory screen, then you belong to the small fraction of viewers willing to confront this reality without turning away. Thank you for that. If this story shifted something in the way you understand history, take a moment now to subscribe to Ancestral, drop a like on this video, and send it to someone who still thinks Genghis Khan was just a great general. Your support is what makes investigations like this possible. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Right now on your screen, another video is waiting. It pulls back the curtain on a different chapter of dark history, another hidden pattern still shaping the world you live in. Don't stop here. Click it and keep going. If you made it this far, you owe it to yourself to find out how much deeper this goes.